Yeah, so I'm Brent Vatne, and I work on Expo. I work with these people at Expo, and I guess it's worth saying that we are hiring. I think this is a pretty good audience for people who might be interested in this kind of thing. So I'll quickly explain what Expo is, because I'm sure some of you either don't know or haven't tried it. So my favorite way, or new favorite way, because this was just said a couple days ago, to describe it is it's like React Native for React Native. We have the Expo SDK, which includes all the APIs listed here, and we add more in each monthly release and kind of improve them continually. So this means you don't have to install and maintain a dependency for each of these APIs. You just import them from the Expo package and just write JavaScript. The Expo SDK, along with React Native Core, makes up the native runtime for Expo apps. And because the native runtime is the same for all apps built with Expo, as in you can't write your own native code, we provide a kind of web browser-like experience with the Expo client, so you can share your code right away with anybody who has the client from the App Store or Play Store. You can publish your projects and list them on your profile. You can search projects that are indexed as well. And of course, if you don't want your project to be public and indexed, you can also specify that. When you want to take your app outside of the client, we have a build service, or you can build the binary on your own. But we provide this build service, so you just run one command, and we give you the binary for the App Store or the Play Store. That said, of course, sometimes you do need to write native code, and we don't want to lock you in to the point that you just can't do that. You build yourself into a dead end. So we have something called Expo Kit, which is just the Expo SDK that you can include in any project. We also released Snack earlier this year. We found it to be a really great way to report issues and get beginners started really quickly. And of course, to include examples in the documentation. Oh yeah, that's coming out all weird, but. All right, so some people like it. You should definitely try it out, I think. We also have the Snack SDK, so things like Replit. Replit's it has a classroom product built on top of what is essentially very similar to Snack. But the classroom gives kind of like lessons using these underlying REPLs. And so this allows Replit to provide a course for React Native. We also work on Create React Native App and React Navigation. And as you can imagine, we have a lot of developers working with Expo, and I work with developers every day who are all along the spectrum. They're either just getting started with React Native, or maybe they're building an app and if further along in the development cycle have it released. And so, kind of all sorts of phases there. Because of that, I'm frequently exposed to the limitations of React Native in the ecosystem, at least in its current form. And so my hope here is to kind of give individuals as well as companies, if you're betting big on React Native, I want to give you kind of a clear picture of what you could do to help your bet pay off in the long run. So I always found that like babies first X, babies first something to be kind of funny. So let's just run with that for this whole thing. So babies first React Native experience. First thing, maybe they go to reactnative.com. Oops, wrong move, don't go there. But who would know? Right, so okay, hopefully they end up in the documentation. So great, yeah, that's pretty good. There's a good tutorial to get started. So they follow along, come up to this thing about adding a text input. Decides that maybe he's going to extend this a bit more and not just have the one text input, but maybe they want to make a login screen and have the text input centered on the screen or something. So he quickly notices that the keyboard gets in the way. So no problem, we're in the documentation already. Let's go to the keyboard documentation. Okay, here's some stuff that's like automatically generated from code. It's kind of like an API reference, but nothing really that addresses this problem. Maybe the closest thing is keyboard avoiding view. So he tries it out. That doesn't go particularly well. So he turns to Google, finds 10 articles explaining how to handle a keyboard. But like, why should he have to do this, right? Why should you have to piece together React Native documentation from various blog posts on the internet, right? It's almost like because we're in the JavaScript community, we expect people to piece together documentation in the same way we piece together like isArray or leftpad or things like that. You just go like pull them from everywhere. So it's sort of strange. thankfully, there is a lot of alternative, or rather there are a lot of alternatives to different ways to learn React Native. So this experience has kind of left the new user maybe a little bit wary of the robustness of the documentation. So they go to explore what's the best course, what's the best book, what's out there. So they come across Egghead here, which is good. I think there's like 10 courses on Udemy. There's a few here. There's a few more. There's more there. There's more there. Some other options. Still more options. There's like 10 books. These are just the ones I found on Amazon. There's probably more. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff. So now the question is not like, how do I like do something in React Native? It's like, what is the best way to learn it? And so you can find people asking this question a lot. How do I do this? How do I even like get started with learning? Which isn't really an ideal question to be asking. All right, so let's talk about like what's the case for educating outside of the documentation? Often it can be like quicker and easier to get done. There's usually no review process if you're just posting it to your personal blog, except one that you impose on yourself. There's no pressure to maybe adhere to some external like voice that should be consistent through the documentation. And of course, no risk of embarrassment if you submit a pull request and maybe you're wrong about something in the docs. Of course, as well, you get to promote yourself. You can promote your own brand or your company's brand. You can help get business. You can play around with different styles of teaching. And of course, you can make money from this kind of educational material, which just helps you produce more. So there are definitely a lot of good reasons to do that. I think there's also a pretty strong case for why you should improve the official documentation. One of them is impact. So you just have way more reach and impact through the documentation than you would through your blog. Another one is that people keep it up to date kind of for you. If there's something out of date in the documentation, someone will eventually, if things are healthy and working well, submit a pull request to improve something that you maybe wrote and was incorrect in the first place or has changed over time. Versus if it's on your blog, someone has to go to your blog, see when it was published, consider, okay, were there any breaking changes, or try it out and then get frustrated and then go to another blog, which isn't really ideal. So this is a not very scientific pie chart, but I think it's mostly true. So if you take a look at this graph, it's a pretty good actual explanation with real data of how much attention the documentation gets. So if you notice that when Create React Native app, okay, yeah, you can read that, was added to the Getting Started guide, it really shot up. And so it shot up to about 1,500 per day on average. And actually this didn't even impact React Native CLI installs, which are pretty consistently averaging around 3,500 a day. And so an interesting thing about this is these are just new users, right? And so there's still so many other people that are visiting the documentation that aren't just going through the Getting Started guide, that are going to other parts. And so if you compare that to maybe your most popular blog post, the number of people that looked at it and recommended it or whatever, there's going to be no comparison. And just for context, actually, between the 1,500 with Create React Native app and the 3,500 from React Native CLI, that's about equivalent to the number of downloads per day that Create React app has now. So it's getting up there. Unfortunately, this is kind of where people spend their time right now on educational materials. So you can kind of compare that to this one. See, it's a little bit skewed in a strange direction. So this is something that isn't just a React Native problem. And I don't think it's just a React problem as well, although this has been observed in React by Dan. It's kind of interesting that out of those 10 books that I showed on an earlier slide, I did a quick search. I could be wrong about this, but I searched for the authors' names in the commit history of the React Native repo, and there wasn't a single commit from any of them in the repo to improve the documentation or anything, which I found kind of strange. First of all, I don't want to guilt them about that. That's fine. Everyone has their own thing to do. I just find it, if your goal is to have an impact, then it's a strange choice to dedicate 100% of your effort to a book rather than maybe combining the different channels. Right? I mean, surely someone has done a better job of explaining transforms in a blog post somewhere than like this auto-generated flow type. And this came up when a coworker tried to do it and was like, I have no idea what's happening here. And there's other stuff all over the place. Okay, so let's have a quick look then. We come across this thing, background color, flow fix me. That's not really a valid type that is useful. Right? So, this was actually in the documentation for 1 year. 1 year in the documentation. So I was like, okay, I came across this. I'm like, I'm going to fix this so I can show you how to do that. So you clone the repository. Here are the steps. It's in the website directory in the React Native repo. I went and found the code. It's in status bar, background color. Saw flow fix me there. Looked at the history, saw it was a year old. Was like, this couldn't be the thing still. So I just went ahead and changed it to a string. Ran the doc server, checked, yeah, that works. Committed it on another branch, pushed it to my fork. Submitted a pull request with some screenshots showing the difference and explaining, like, I don't really know why this was this in the first place, but it doesn't seem right, so I made it another thing. And then Hector imported it, and so this will now run the tests internally at Facebook, and once that's done, they can merge it. And when it gets merged, it's there. So now it doesn't say flow fix me for that. So you could do this too, right? Those are pretty simple series of steps. And that's for the auto-generated stuff. There's also markdown documentation that you can go and edit directly that's even more straightforward. It's worth pointing out that like working on your own educational materials isn't mutually exclusive with contributing to the docs. So for example, Devin Abbott worked on React Native Express, and then he took this, a bunch of the work that he did there and actually put it into the documentation. He got paid for it, but you know. Jared Forsyth, another example of someone who I think does a good job at this. So he wrote this really good blog post recently about how to use React with Reason, and immediately followed that up with saying he's going to now start working on the documentation and website for Reason. Because he's learned a lot from doing that, and you can take that and bring it into the actual documentation. So here's an example of some dumb idiot doing it wrong, where they like make a Medium blog post because it's like the easiest thing to do. I'm like, oh, hey, the React Dev Tools work with React Native now, so I go ahead and write this. And only in hindsight realized, oh, I probably should have just added that to the documentation. But Dan did it ultimately. But I mean, this was something that I could have done myself, and I'm sure Dan has better things to do than write documentation for React Native. So you know, if we can help out with these kinds of things, we free up other resources for working on hopefully more complicated problems. And I mean, I did it anyways. I just didn't put it in there. So it's stupid. Okay, one last thought on documentation before we move on. I really like that in Rust they have a community team, and they also have like a documentation sub-team. I think only one Mozilla employee actually works on the documentation team. Maybe we need something like that in React Native. I'm not entirely sure. But if you're interested in that, definitely talk to me. And I think Hector is here as well. He's the guy that's kind of holding the fort on the documentation. Like, I think we should give him a round of applause for that, because he's doing most of it himself right now, I think. And I think the last thing is just that, again, I just want to reiterate, I don't think anyone should feel guilted into like working on open source stuff. That is absolutely the worst motivation to do anything. And I think you should do it because you want to have a bigger impact, and it's definitely the best way to have a big impact. Okay, so back to this, this storyline involving this baby. So the baby follows some guides, and everything's going fine until they come across some error. I mean, they probably came across this warning when they first started the project about React create class deprecated and prop types. I mean, that's its own thing. Let's just not even get into that. But maybe this thing came along at some point. Oh, FB batch bridge. I don't know. What does that mean? If you don't know the right? That's a completely useless error message. Aside from it being fairly easy to Google, which is definitely a valuable characteristic in an error message. But so it's got that going for it. That said, like there could be something better there, right? Another one is like calling into some native APIs. Maybe they called into like the alert dialog and passed in a string where it was expecting an array or something, and then they just get a red screen that says, oh, expected array and was type string for this thing that maybe people didn't even know existed. So another area where this can happen is in the CLI. So currently there's a required version of Node, but it's never validated. So you just get some error that like, oh, you tried to do this like triple dot thing in front of a variable name, and I don't know what to do, so I give up, was kind of what Node does. I mean, there should be some validations there, right? So like we try and do that a bit with Expo. We, like with font loading, we try and give you a warning if you try and do it in a way that doesn't work very well, and we validate the Node version because, well, actually NPM version here because NPM 5 broke a lot of things. It's getting better now though. And yeah, these are kind of things that everyone can contribute to. If you come across an error message, maybe think how can you clarify it, or how can you maybe provide better validation up front so that you don't even get to the point of the error message, and help people figure out problems with their code more easily. Okay, so the error message wasn't so useful. Now the user's like pretty confused, and so they head to GitHub issues. Right? There are a lot of issues there, and a lot of pull requests. It's kind of intimidating, so they kind of ask themselves, like, why are people not dealing with these? A good example of this is like, this is what my GitHub notifications look like after like 2 days of not reading them. Notice there's 95 participating on there as well. So like, a lot of people who are working on React Native, it's not a good excuse, don't get me wrong, but a lot of people are very busy, right? We have a lot of stuff. We need some help with these kinds of things as well. I, unfortunately, haven't spent a lot of time on helping triage issues recently, but this is something that everybody can definitely help do. So I'm going to tell you how to do that. So a key thing is basically the flow is like, understand if it is actually a bug. If not, then send them to Stack Overflow. Try and get more information from them if they don't provide information. Test it on your own. So yeah, let's walk through that. So reading issues, that's the first step. You go and read issues. So actually how I got started with contributing to React Native was I started just playing with it, and I found that a good way to learn more about it was to read the issues people had and try and solve them on my own. And then I just ended up doing that a lot and found that it would be useful if I could close issues as well, because otherwise I kept having to ping people to say, hey, this thing is done, you can close it now. So I found I learned a lot from that as well. So okay, we read this issue here. Expose something as public method. Yeah, I'm not going to work on that one. I don't know what's going on. So I go to the next one. Like, this one, okay, yeah, undefined is not an object, something current owner. Well, you know, I'm not really able to reproduce this with the information that they're given. So I reply and just say, hey, is this happening when you create a new project? Because there's no reproduction case, even though we asked for it in the issue template. So I just try and get enough information so that, like, whether, I mean, if I can't reproduce it, if I don't understand what's going on, there's no way that it's going to be fixed, right? Unless by accident. And so this is really helpful to other maintainers to at least be able to go to an issue and understand what the issue is and know that it's an issue and not some red herring for some error in their code, which goes back to error messages from before, which would be nice to clean up. Okay, so I've done that. Now I go back and we got an invalid character, some backticks not supported. Again, they didn't provide a way to reproduce this. This one though, I'm like, yeah, I can try this on Snack. So I go to Snack, I recreate it, and then I switch from iOS to Android, and I find that on Android it's not working. So I go back, share my findings, share the repro case, and I actually happen to know what's going on in this case, so I explain that. Of course, you don't have to know what's going on. Even just providing a Snack link that shows the error happening is pretty good and helpful for anyone who looks at it later. Right, okay, read an issue, easy enough, already resolved, so I just use this Facebook GitHub bot and say close. And so if you want to have access to this, if you want to help out with issue triaging, you can talk to Hector about that as well. All right, read issues, send to Stack Overflow. And then the last step, you can actually help them on Stack Overflow too. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And you can get those sweet Stack Overflow points, right? So that guy asked a question, post an answer there. And you know, it's kind of nice. Sometimes people are really appreciative of it. And so that was good. Okay, so managed to sort through this problem, get further along in the app. And now we're at the point where we want to add some library to the project. So first question you might ask is, does a library exist to do what I need? I don't know. If you ask on the community group, you might get sassed with a let me Google it for you link. So maybe you're afraid of doing that. Some people might wonder if they started using Create React Native app, they're like, oh, does this thing work with that? Or is there some alternative for it? Which library is the best? There's a lot of alternatives out there, and it's good to know the pros and cons of various options and be able to pick the one that works best for you. You're also probably wondering if the project is healthy or maintained. And as a quick tangent on that, if you don't maintain your project, you should definitely do something like this. Just make it very clear to people, hey, this isn't being maintained anymore. So if you go there or read anything about it, you just know immediately, I probably shouldn't use this. Then you might also ask, like, how can I get a feel for this? It's one thing to look at a README with an image or with no images or whatever. How can I actually try it? So a lot of projects actually include examples, directories, and whatever. But I mean, this is a huge hassle if you have 6 different libraries that you want to try. And you go and clone them all and try and get them running. Maybe some of the example projects are not working because the project's not properly maintained. And so it can just turn into this whole mess of frustrations. So we actually just made this thing called native.directory. Unfortunately, you can't see it too clearly there. But we're trying to help solve this problem. So this is an open source project. We just built it in the last couple of weeks at Expo. And we hope that people will jump in and help us building this and create like a way for people to easily find libraries and evaluate libraries and try them out and that kind of thing. And so you can see we pull information out about various links, or rather images that are available from the README. We get data from NPM for the number of downloads, issues from GitHub, all of that, and combine them to use this really awful heuristic for determining the health of a project. So feel free to jump in there and weigh in on what you think determines the health of a project. And also another thing that's really nice is we are soon going to be adding this capability to Snack that allows you to install NPM packages. We have it working pretty well, so should hopefully be out soon. And so this is an example of me just copying an example out of a project on GitHub, and then it just runs in here. And so what you could do is associate this with your project, and then anyone on native directory can go and click on a link to an example and run it immediately on their phone or run it within Snack and even edit the code and see the changes live. So I think that'll be really helpful for discovering things. And yeah, definitely check this project out, native.directory. Go to, we call it React Native Libraries on the repo for some reason. Naming is pretty hard, so if you have ideas for that as well, let us know. Okay, so our first time user has some libraries now. Things are working all right, but some of them don't feel quite right? Like, for example, this truck, he wanted a truck, but he has this little plastic toy truck. So it's not exactly what he was looking for. And I think that there's this, everybody quotes Rich Hickey, but I'm going to do it as well here. I really like this thing. It's in a lot of communities, everything, there's a lot of positivity. That's great. You should be really positive. Sometimes it goes a bit too far, and everything is so awesome and so great, and there's kind of this culture where you can't really give constructive criticism on a lot of things. And I find that we're maybe leaning towards that direction in the React Native community. I would like to see more honest, constructive feedback on how things can get better and what the limitations are with certain libraries and tools. And I think we really need to challenge each other to be better and build really high quality tools. So an example of this is, so Leland tweeted about this a few weeks ago. Why does nobody use the actual native feedback REPL on Android in their libraries? Of course, nobody is an exaggeration, but there are some libraries that do it. But I think it's a minority. So an example here is, if we look at the app for this conference, React navigation in the default tab bar should have native feedback when you're touching those tabs. That's just how it works on Android. So that's the one on the left. I remade the app for fun, and on the right, you could see that it does have native feedback, but I actually had to fork the tab bar and add native feedback to it. And there are some other little details like that that are really important for libraries to consider. So on the right side as well, when you tap on the tab bar, it will scroll to the top of the scroll view in the current tab. These are really small things, but I think they add up over time. Actually, was there anything else there? Oh yeah, and things like long pressing to switch tabs. You probably don't really think about it, but sometimes you might long press on a tab and then it'll switch. That's not currently the default behavior. I'm picking on React navigation because we work on it, and that's fine to pick on it in that case, I think. Of course, yeah, I don't want to try and call anybody out or anything, but Skevy, come on. Speaking of Skevy, though, this is good. So here's yeah, that's a big project, I'm sorry, Skevy. So here's an example of a really small detail that is, to most people it probably won't make a difference, but you just might notice this small thing when you're using the default navigation on iOS, which is that there's a mask on the back button so that the text doesn't show up underneath the button and on either side of the chevron. And that just doesn't exist for the JavaScript-based navigation libraries right now. So what Skevy did here was he went upstream, contributed this thing. Who knows if that'll actually get merged. If it doesn't, because the core should probably stay small, he might just bring it out into another library. But ultimately, it's looking at what are these little details that you can take care of as a library author that will make everyone using your library have much more polished apps. So I don't remember why I sent myself this email, but I think it was so that I mentioned here, silly things are these small things that seem silly when you look at them individually, and oh, why would I spend a day or 2 days making a masked view on just so I can have this text go like this? I mean, it sounds silly, but I mean, we're kind of in the business of minutia and tedium, so we kind of have to get used to that and really focus on the details. We should also document the limitations of the libraries. So there's some things that our libraries just aren't particularly good at. For example, this baby probably shouldn't eat an electrical cable, especially not if it's plugged into a socket. But either way, it's not a very good idea. So I came across this idea recently of an anti-pitch. So you might pitch your product. So you might say, you want to convince someone, this is why you should use my thing. But an anti-pitch is how can you, you want to convince them that they shouldn't use your thing. And I think that provides a really balanced perspective for anyone approaching some tool where they can immediately see the limitations and they know, okay, I shouldn't eat this. I should plug it into the wall. And so that's, I think, there's not a lot of examples of it out there in the wild. This is from a blog post for a tool called RipRep, which is a really fast search tool. And so it'd just be cool to see maybe more people do that. We're definitely working on something like that for providing a comprehensive pitch and anti-pitch for Expo, so we'll put that out at some point in time. Okay, so after trying out some libraries like React Native Camera, they kind of found that some of them don't really do what they need. So our big old baby takes to Twitter, and big old bald baby, and vents his frustrations. Why isn't there a camera? Oh, give me things for free, world, right? You need to do better. And meanwhile, on Twitter, elsewhere, other open source developers lament the fact that this ubiquitous tool can barely afford to pay a low salary for the core developer on the tool. And so there's definitely a problem, and this is probably a trend. If you're on Twitter, you've been noticing that projects and open source developers don't really have the funding that they need a lot of the time to actually dedicate a lot of resources to their tool. It's definitely a problem in React Native as well. So if you look at the Canny feature request board, you'll see that the top requested feature, this has the most upvotes. It surprised me. I actually hadn't looked at the top in a while because it defaults to trending. But the top is the ability to load SVG images. And I mean, React Native SVG, don't get me wrong, it's not a perfect library. It has a lot of problems, but a lot of people depend on it right now, and it kind of just does a thing decently. And if we want something like this to get better, we're either going to have a company that has a huge interest in doing it, going and implementing it on their own, or we have to support people that are working on this. And so there's only actually 2 people supporting this project right now, and that's Expo and I think React Native training as well. And so it's kind of, surprising that we don't have more of that. There are other ways to do things as well. You can do like bug bounties. So I think Airbnb started doing this recently. But it's kind of worth asking yourself, like, what tools does your company use? And which ones are you supporting financially? How much do you depend on them? How much value do they provide? What would happen if someone stopped maintaining them? So it's definitely worth considering. I wrote about it a while ago, so if you want to read more, put it there. Okay, so the tenuous baby narrative that I have going kind of falls apart at this point, but here are some babies sitting around a computer. I'm going to talk about contributing to React Native now. So there's a really good episode of the Software Engineering Daily podcast where Preethi interviews Tom Occhino, and thankfully it's transcribed, so I could copy and paste this rather than type it. And so a really interesting point from this is that there's this concept of meaningful adoption. So there's adoption, which is just people using your thing, and then there's meaningful adoption, which is like you actually get some value as the organization that released this from people using your thing. There is no, you don't necessarily have value from more people. In fact, as he points out, there's actually additional costs to having to support more people and more use cases. And so it's kind of interesting to look at a chart. I ran git short log -sne. This is not a perfect way to do it. It includes merge commits and whatever, but just as like a quick way to get some idea of who contributes to React Native. And you can see that Facebook, and this is only out of the top 150. I did not have time to go through 1,600 people and label their companies, but I did manually label companies for 150 people, so we got something there. Facebook is up top with 7,000 commits out of people in the top 150. And so I think number 150 is like a person with 9 commits or something like that. So it covers like most of the large contributors to the project. Then there's Expo and App and Flow, Call Stack, Software Management, Microsoft. So there's so much work to be done on React Native, whether it's like improving the documentation, error messages, adding polish throughout the tool itself. And Facebook, I think, is driving a lot of the deepest, hardest work on it. So things like the Android Nodes project or like React Fiber, stuff like that. But there's a lot of just work that isn't deep work, but that is work that I think everybody can do and would be extremely valuable to help with that. You can check out the data there if you want. And I know this is not a complete picture of the ecosystem, right? Like Airbnb and Wix, for example, don't know how they did show up there, but they apparently don't. But they obviously contribute in other massive ways by having some of the most important libraries in the ecosystem, and like Infinite Red as well, organizing a conference, having these other tools and everything. So definitely not a complete picture. It's just interesting to look at that angle, I think, and see where are the commits coming from and who's actually working on the core itself. So going back to that point that Tom made, it's worth asking yourself here is what is your company's net impact on the React Native community? Are you giving more than you're taking? Are you okay with that? If you're okay with that, that's fine. But if you want to balance that out, then there are definitely ways that you can do that. Maybe we need something like an open collective so that we can have a way to pay people outside of Facebook who are contributing their time to work on the tool. All right, so I'm just going to end with this kind of note. So React Native is still a pretty minor player in this ecosystem in terms of mobile apps. Nobody has a number, but it's definitely a very distant minority of very small percentage of apps on the App Store and Play Store. We're 2 years in at this point. It's not really new. I think we have to now shift from the mentality of we have this new tool and we need to bootstrap it, and we kind of have to go, okay, we're at a point where we've built a lot of awesome stuff. Now we have to kind of take it to the next level, and I think that it's really largely up to a lot of people in this room to help out with that. But I'm pretty optimistic about it. I think that we've come a really long way since 2 years ago with React Native. And the whole ecosystem is definitely growing, and so I'm looking forward to see what happens in the next few years. So thank you.